The Sherman. Look at it. Kinda looks like a toy sometimes, but it's certainly a tank. One that stirs up way more controversy than it has any right to. Is it bad? Is it good? Does bad or good even apply to tanks? Well, yeah. But I was under the impression that most World War II enthusiasts were a little beyond the era of judging tanks purely based on armor thickness and gun size, but as it turns out, we're not. In my last video talking about how AI affects hobby historians, I got quite a few comments from people who genuinely believed some of this and didn't understand what the issue was when the AI would say something like the Sherman was prone to fires, which is honestly not at all their fault. But I didn't want to make another video that just busts open myths about the Sherman, so I'll also be talking about its use in different fronts, the challenges it faced, and how it performed, to paint a better picture of the why and what for of the Sherman. Before we look at the Sherman itself, it's important we look at its predecessor, the M3, to understand why the Sherman turned out the way it did. You can skip ahead if you're just here for Sherman knowledge to be lasered directly into your gray matter. The M3 Lee matters, but if you're not interested, these next few minutes aren't super necessary. So the M3 Lee was an important stopgap that would significantly influence the design of the M4 Sherman. The only reason it exists, however, is due to the fact that the US didn't have the industrial capacity yet and design to make thousands of medium tanks with a rotating turret that housed a 75. So they simply did the next best thing and stuck it in the hole of an M2 and gave it a 37 and a smaller turret. Needless to say, it was a bit of a tower. Now, how could the US lack the capacity to make tanks? Well, despite the fact that even then the US was an industrial powerhouse, tank development was largely ignored after World War I thanks to a desire for isolationism, and also because of the greatest economic disaster the country had ever faced. Tank development was on hardly anybody's mind. Now, the M3 Lee, being a tank with 7 crew members, including 2 entirely different cannons, a whole plethora of issues became obvious. Among these were horrible ergonomics, the inability of crew members to communicate effectively, and having 2 guns mounted in different ways was a maintenance nightmare. Being the predecessor to the Sherman, it's more defined by how it was bad at everything the Sherman was good for. The M3, while good enough for the time, was much more about what not to do, and the Sherman only really borrows a few aspects of its design, including the vertical stabilizer, which was an original innovation of the M3 Lee. Now, while the M3 Lee would see success in North Africa and some of the Pacific, the Allies would need a pretty substantial upgrade if they were going to be fighting a global war. Thus the topic of this video. Up until now, the North Africa campaign was a tug of war with many battles and offenses being decided by supply in a particularly logistically hostile theater. Now, the Sherman would see its first combat under British use in the Second Battle of El Alamein, where they would face mostly Panzer IIIs and IVs, vehicles that were equal to the British tanks but were outclassed by the M4 almost entirely. And it is here that the Sherman would aid in the crushing defeat of Rommel's forces and mark the turning point of the Africa campaign. After this, the Americans would do Operation Torch with the idea of linking up with British forces from El Alamein in order to encircle and conquer Tunisia. Now, there isn't really anything like the Sherman that compares to it at this point. In North Africa, there weren't even many Panzer IVs with the long 75. In fact, there were only a handful ever sent throughout the entirety of the campaign. It's kind of weird to see the Sherman outside of the Pacific theater that is considered well armored, but it had quite the edge here. I mean, there wouldn't even be Tigers in North Africa up until it's already over down there, and even then they sent less than 30. Now, these Tigers would engage the Allies, but were so rare they couldn't make much impact. When the Allies did finally capture Tunisia, they would also get their hands on a mostly intact Tiger 131. You know Tiger 131. It took it out of retirement so Brad Pitt and Shia LaBeouf could blow it up in fury. Anyways, the Sherman in the North Africa campaign was overall a great success, and its strengths were highlighted here. It didn't face any unique problems overall besides poor crew training, but that's hardly the tank's fault. And it mostly resulted in key features of the Sherman being underutilized, like the vertical stabilizer. If there was a root cause for Sherman hatred, it's not in North Africa. I kind of make it sound like the Sherman was the single reason why the Allies were able to do this. Obviously, that's not true. That's never how modern conflicts work. The Allied advance vastly outnumbered the Germans, consisting not just of English and American forces, but also Free French, Greek, South Africans, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, and even the Libyan Arab force. In July of '43, the Allies would go on to invade Sicily, and in September, the mainland into the soft underbelly of Europe. But before we dive into that front, we also need to examine the Sherman's use on the other side of the planet in a very different environment. Tank use in the Pacific was limited due to the island-hopping nature of the front. Tanks couldn't be used in grand sweeping maneuvers to cut off enemy advance and encircle them. They were very oftenly instead forced to support infantry in dense jungles. With exception to the heat, the Pacific theater was in great contrast to the North Africa campaign. So this is where the Sherman's versatility becomes more obvious. It was technically the heaviest tank that was deployed to the Pacific, and despite this, it remained the most mechanically reliable one. Not only that, but the 75 was not only perfectly capable of penetrating medium tank armor, but proved to be a great high explosive slinger. In the Pacific, the Sherman would mostly be shooting high explosive at fortified infantry positions and torching bunkers. The M4A3R3 was a Sherman that replaced its gun with a flamethrower. The name Zippo, being related to the Sherman's likeness to explode, is purely a post-war myth, as well as any other lighter-related nicknames. It was instead given to this specific variant of the Sherman because it lights things on fire. Like the Japanese.
Shampoo.
To highlight how close quarters this was for armor, some Shermans were provided with canister shot instead of HE because it was more effective against swarms of infantry in ranges under 200 meters. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a single surviving photo of this round. There are plenty of accounts describing it and mentioning its use, but no photos. I got a picture of a shrapnel round though, which is different, but it's close enough. The reason Japanese infantry would swarm Shermans was to use equipment like the lunge mine to effectively bayonet tanks with the shaped charged bombs. Basically just like a Panzerfaust on a stick. And if they didn't have that, which they actually commonly didn't, Japanese infantry would swarm Shermans and try to bust them open with shovels, pickaxes, and whatever they had to get at the crew inside. Kind of like how you'd crack open a crab to get at the meat inside. It's a unique level of scrutiny that no other vehicle really faced outside of the Pacific. Now don't get me wrong, on the Eastern Front T-34s and Tigers were up to their own shenanigans, with Soviets sometimes driving directly into Tigers at Kursk, but the jungle gave the Japanese the opportunity to really dissect the Sherman. Kinda like watching an octopus try to open a jar. But if they didn't have at least some kind of explosives or an already compromised hatch to exploit, these attempts with picks and crowbars were seldom effective. The most common Sherman killers were still anti-tank guns and mines, etc. So what about Japanese armor? What about Japanese armor? But no, seriously, they basically stopped making tanks. For example, the Tiger 1 weighing at 57 tons saw about 1,300 being made, whereas the Chi-Ha at 15 tons saw about 2,000 being made. Not even mentioning the Tiger only saw 2 years of production from 42 to 44, and the Chi-Ha started in fucking 38. That's more than double the total tonnage of the Chi-Ha. I'm not even going to bother comparing it to Sherman numbers. So no, they weren't particularly relevant, even when they did make an appearance. The Sherman proved to be an excellent asset in the Pacific. The way it was used didn't change from the start to the end of the entire campaign. The cause for the Sherman's poor reputation isn't here. Now let's go back to July of 43. The Allies invade Sicily. Less than a month later, Mussolini is deposed. The Allies invade into mainland Italy for the first time in September, and in less than a week this new government switches sides and Germany invades. The Allies advance as German forces assume control of what the failed Italian regime lost, killing Italian civilians and Italian soldiers in the process. By November, the initial Allied advance would come to a halt entirely, against the Gustav Line. This is what the soft underbelly of Europe actually turned into. Italy is kind of like a corridor. It's long, not very wide, and much of the terrain turns into valleys and mountains as you go north. This area of Italy between Naples and Rome would become a sort of meat grinder for the Allied forces, especially around Monte Cassino. The Sherman might be about 0% meat, but boy did that thing get grinded. The terrain the Allies were up against being a series of narrow valleys, rivers, mountains, all with a variety of German entrenchment, including vehicles like the Stuke 3, the Marder, Panzer IV with the Long 75, and a little bit of the Tiger 1. Unlike in North Africa or the Pacific, all these tanks were perfectly capable of penetrating the Sherman from any practical range. Shermans that were fairly oftenly being funneled down narrow pathways where the Germans turned every hill into a bunker and mined as many roads as they could afford to. More oftenly, the Churchill was the preferred Allied tank for these uphill assaults, where its low max speed was a non-issue when it was offered the opportunity to behave as a breakthrough vehicle, where its thicker armor and better climbing ability was highly valued. The Churchill was basically built for this role specifically. So how did the Sherman do in Italy? Well, there are the obvious. It was easy to repair, easy to recover, crew survived slightly more than other tanks, and they still had their high explosive rounds for anything that wasn't armored, which at the end of the day was still most things. But since North Africa, this is where the Sherman's weaknesses would begin to shine through, and where many myths might have begun to fester. Now let's look closer at the Sherman. While they might have burned about the same as other tanks with dry ammo stowage, the Sherman also sported many escape routes that were often wider than other vehicles. This is likely the cornerstone of the Sherman's poor reputation. Tanks would get hit, crews were more likely to survive, but maybe the entire crew didn't survive. Then decades later, veterans give an interview on his service and is forced to relive a traumatic near-death experience. But it was just that, near-death. Even if it was traumatic, he did live and likely continue to fight the rest of the war. Not something that could be easily said for T-34 crews who had to get by with cramped interiors and fewer, heavier hatches. The Gustav Line will halt the Allies' advance until the fall of Monte Cassino mid-May, marking the German retreat to the Gothic Line and leading to the liberation of Rome on June 4th, 1944, only 2 days before the invasion of Normandy. The invasion of Normandy is, to this day, one of the greatest feats of logistics ever put on display in any conflict. And in the midst of all this, the Sherman would finally see its wet ammunition stowage installed, with mass implementation occurring as the Allies went deeper into Normandy. Now, how does the wet ammo stowage actually work? Well, the idea and intent was to give the ammo a sort of water jacket it could sit in, so if the ammo was hit, the water would immediately douse any fire. Now, the wet ammo storage did lower burn rates, but the reason why has to do little with the water itself. Now before, when it was just dry ammo storage, the ammo was stored on the walls inside of the Sherman. We can see here and here where extra armor was added on the outside to help protect it. This didn't work very well, but later, with the wet ammo configuration, the ammo would then sit on the floor instead, all the way down there. Now, being moved down so low, it was seldom hit at all, bringing burn rates down from 60% to about 10 to 15%. Having crew survivability increase this drastically does two things to our perception of the Sherman post-war. One is that it needed the wet ammo storage, whereas other tanks were fine without it. And two, as previously mentioned, we now have more surviving vets ready to give traumatic interviews. That second part will become more important in a minute. Now, starting with D-Day, Shermans would begin to sport the 76mm and 17-pounder guns, which were perfectly capable of penetrating heavier armored tanks like the Tiger, which the Allies feared disproportionately. Another important note about tanks like the Panther and Tiger is that at this point their absolute peak numbers were still less than about 500 in the West. Numbers vary wildly from different sources, so I'm deliberately being vague, but it cannot be overstated how the Tiger's greatest strength wasn't even its actual performance, but the reputation it developed. This reputation that developed would be known as Tiger Panic. The combination of actual battlefield success and Axis propaganda created a myth of the Tiger that the Allies generally believed, especially the tankers. To most Allied soldiers, any German gun with a muzzle brake on it was an 88. Panzer IV, the 75, 88. Panther gun, 88. And the 88 makes it a Tiger, a tank among tanks. And now Shermans were being equipped with guns they didn't even need to shoot Tiger armor that wasn't even there. But when Shermans did finally encounter Tigers, we get the old 5 Shermans for every 1 Tiger myth. Or was it like 15? Or something like 11? No, they really can't come to a consensus for how unstoppable the very stopped Tiger was. I mean, of course Tigers got that many kills. I mean, for example, Otto Carius, an Eastern Front tank ace, is credited with 150 kills in his entire career. We know this because he wrote it in a book about himself. A very humble man. Alright, well, what about a Western Front tank ace, like Michael Whitman, and oh, he died. He was killed by a Sherman, actually, in Normandy. Oh well. You know, we probably should stop comparing the Sherman to big cats anyways. I mean, it faced them so little, it was basically a non-issue. In fact, whenever we look at vehicles, we need to remember that they were in the greater context of a war, of combined arms. Instead of making a tank for a job, the Sherman was a tank for many jobs, not just supporting infantry. By the end of the war, it was perfectly capable of destroying enemy armor, infantry, and even acting as artillery, all without an insane logistical footprint. And yes, a lot of people don't even remember or care to mention that normal tanks, not dedicated self-propelled guns, could be used for artillery. Every other nation did use their tanks in this manner on occasion, but the Sherman not only was designed with greater gun elevation to support this role, but was doctrinally integrated. There's actually a few manuals showing you how to do this. Not that the Sherman could replace dedicated artillery guns, but it was better at that role than other medium tanks. Alright, I'm kinda getting off track. Back to those surviving vets from earlier. So, a bunch of vets are surviving and they might have mixed feelings about their experience being almost blown up. So what about Soviet or German tankers? We know they had lower survivability, but there were definitely survivors. While going to German tankers, we do have post-war memoirs, but these are often very hard to trust, especially from something like Tigers in the Mud by Otto Carius, who not only likely made up his kill count but also ignored or minimized German war crimes while also being very vocal about how much he wanted those who slandered the German Wehrmacht to be punished. It's important to remember Carius is an ideologue and an actual Nazi who perpetuated many myths about the German military. He's effectively the father of the clean Wehrmacht myth. Now, most tankers weren't interested in writing books post-war, they just returned to their normal lives, unlike Otto Carius, who felt like he needed to de-slanderize the Wehrmacht. And even if a post-war T-34 crew member wanted to write a memoir, it would have been heavily filtered by Moscow. But the Allied tanker, the Canadian, the American, or English dude, or whatever, that drove the Sherman were not only much more widely available and out in society, but also perfectly capable of giving interviews. Perfectly capable of retelling either a traumatic experience or sharing the general sentiment of the Tiger Panic from their service. The Sherman's performance and reputation are like night and day. It did its job oftenly better than its contemporaries, but in media and I guess lower level tank hobbyists, it's a, forgive me for using the term, death trap. So, is the Sherman good or bad? Honestly, by now, you should already know. When making this video, I tried to use exclusively online sources for accessibility for you guys to see where I got my stuff instead of citing a Zaloga book you probably don't own. And no, I didn't use Wikipedia. But even if I did, Mark Felton did it, so why can't I? But anyways, this video was supposed to be much shorter, so if you enjoyed it, please subscribe and like and leave a comment and share this video and sing my praises.